everyone today that's joining us online for the second webinar for Division 15 entitled Keeping Educational Psychology Relevant in the 21st Century, the Case for Motivation. My name is Matt Irvin. I'm at the University of South Carolina and I'll be moderating this event today. Joining us for as our speaker is Dr. Eric Anderman, who probably needs no introduction, but I'll provide a brief introduction here. Dr. Anderman is chair of the Department of Educational Studies and professor of educational psychology. After working as a middle school and high school teacher, he earned his PhD in educational psychology from the University of Michigan. He studies academic motivation, focusing in particular on academic cheating, the effects of school transitions on motivation, and HIV, pregnancy prevention in adolescence. He's a fellow of both the APA and the AERA. He recently co-edited the third edition of the Handbook of Educational Psychology and the International Guide to Student Achievement. He's also co-author of 3 textbooks and numerous articles that I'm sure many of us have read, and chapters as well. His research on academic cheating has been featured in numerous media outlets, including CBS News, NBC News, CNN, Huffington Post, and numerous others. So I welcome Dr. Anderman today, and before we begin, let me mention, by the way, for those of you that are joining us online, you'll not be able to speak directly to us and ask us questions. But if you have any questions or comments, please type those in the chat box to the lower right corner of your screen. Welcome, Dr. Anderman.
Thank you, Matt, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today, and unfortunately, as you can probably hear, they're mowing the lawn right outside my office. Great timing. The topic for today is keeping educational psychology relevant in the 21st century, the case for motivation. And what I'd like to do in the time I have available is to get you thinking about what it is our field is about and what the world is like out there in terms of how our field is thought about and what we can do to be proactive and reactive to keep our field relevant. I'm going to be speaking broadly about the whole field. I'm going to use examples from motivation because that's my area. That's the area I know best. And I'm also going to use the area of motivation because one of the points that I'd like to make is that we know so much good science about motivation that we can do in schools that costs no money to implement. And when people talk about all the millions of dollars we need to invest in school reform, that's very important, that's very real, but there are a lot of things we can do simply by training teachers in certain kinds of practices where the cost really is nil. So, whoops. There we go. My objectives. What are my objectives for this webinar? First of all, I want to just talk about why we should care about this topic. I want to give you a little bit of information about why the field of educational psychology is relevant and also show you that, there is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of language in major organizations that really emphasizes what we do and values what we do. And I want to emphasize this in particular in terms of when I say what is at stake. If we don't do this, what are some of the dangers of our field? Could our field become irrelevant? Could our field become absorbed by other fields? Could we lose our identity? Is our field valued? What I want to do is provide you with some evidence to show you that there's a huge amount of value for what we do out there. And so we have a lot of support. We have, we don't really need a grassroots movement. There's a lot of people who value what we do already. But there also are obstacles, and I want to talk about some of the obstacles, some of the things that get in our way, in particular, some of the information that's out there in education that sometimes falls under the umbrella of educational psychology, but actually is not really rooted in good science, but nevertheless falls under our umbrella, and we sometimes get discredited because of things like that. And finally, I want to end with what can we do? So, there's all this information about people valuing us and some of the misinformation out there. what can we do to make a difference? And I think there's plenty of things that we can do. So I wanted to start by talking about some of the language that's put forth by major organizations. And when you look at some of the major organizations out there, professional organizations, accreditation agencies, when you look at these, there's a lot of language that uses terms from EdPsych, all right? And one of the things that I did, and this is not very scientific, but just to look for some things, I did some searching in various professional organizations, websites, and publications. And the first one I wanted to share is ASCD, which is the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. And this is a very big organization, particularly in educational administration. A lot of principals, a lot of superintendents, a lot of practitioners belong to this organization. And so what I wanted to do is say, do they, in their documents, in their information that they put out there, do they talk about things that we value and do in EdPsych? And in particular, I focused on motivation. And what I want to do is just show you some of the words. So the highlighted words, I looked for words, I searched for words that are pretty common in the motivation literature, but that would be used by practitioners. So one of the statements that they had, they list 11 qualities that they put out there of effective teachers. And these are research-based. One of them is hold high expectations for themselves and their students. So the word expectation, that's something obviously in EdPsych, expectations, expectancies, big thing that we talk about. Are caring, fair, and respectful. Lots of research about the roles of teacher and student relationships and the role of caring teachers. Maximize instructional time via effective classroom management and organization. Most organizations talk about the importance of management and organization, and that's something that pretty much in any introductory EdPsych course, if you look in any intro EdPsych book, we have those in there. Present content to students in a meaningful way that fosters understanding. So again, meaningful, presenting meaningful information. Monitoring students' learning by utilizing pre and post assessments, providing timely and informative feedback, and reteaching material to students who did not achieve mastery. The word mastery appears there. And again, this is something to remind you, this is what a major organization supporting administration in schools, superintendents and principals, is saying these are the things that really good, effective teachers do. Out of the 11, 5 of them talk about motivation and EdPsych. So my point in showing you this is to say that professional organizations do value the things that we do research on. Second one I looked at was CAPE, the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, which is the major organization that accredits most of our, if not all, teacher education programs. These are the standards that we need to have in teacher education programs when we prepare teachers to teach in schools. And again, when you look at the 2015 CAPE standards, there are a lot of standards CAPE has. I looked at the general 2015 standards. Again, a lot of mention of things that we do. Making the discipline accessible and meaningful for learners to assure mastery. So the word meaningful was the one I searched on, but the word mastery came up also. Applying knowledge in meaningful ways. So this idea of making things meaningful, which is something in motivation, we talk about expectancy value theory, values, mastery. That's prominent in what we do in that area. Teacher works to, I didn't put everything here, create environments that support engagement and self-motivation. Qualities outside of academic ability are associated with teacher effectiveness. These include grit and the ability to motivate. I didn't highlight grit because, well, that's a topic for another talk. Critical role that assessment plays. Assessment, the idea that assessment can motivate students, the idea of using assessment in a formative and summative manner to motivate students to learn and not just to measure what students have learned. Ensure that candidates implement learning experiences to engage students and improve learning. Lots of use of the word engagement. Use different perspectives to engage learners. And teacher understands and use multiple methods of assessment to engage learners. And then finally, technology creates new ways to engage learners, more engagement. And technology can help teachers connect content with students' interests and connect students with inspiring experts, mentors, and peers. Lots of examples, probably more than I needed to make the point, but the point I'm trying to make is that CAPE, in their standards, which all universities pretty much who do teacher ed now have to adhere to, is using a lot of terminology that comes from the field of motivation. And there's lots of others. There are other ed psych terms. I just searched for motivation ones. So this is, again, to show you that organizations out there do value what we do and embrace what we do. I also wanted to mention, some of you may be familiar with this and some not, but the APA, the Coalition for Psychology in the Schools, which I'm a member of, put out something this called the Top 20 Principles for Pre-K to 12 Education. This has gotten a lot of press, it's gotten a lot of PR, it's already been translated into Spanish and Mandarin. There's a web link there, and we'll make that available for folks. But this is essentially a project where, for a long time, groups of scientists from all areas of psychology came together to identify what we call the top 20 principles that, from psychology, that can be used to improve learning and help learning in pre-K to 12 environments. And there were 5 areas identified, 5 categories: cognition and learning, motivation, social context and emotional, context and learning, and assessment. And one of the 5 areas, again, was motivation. And I'm mentioning this because this comes directly from APA, who's sponsoring this webinar. And again, motivation, which is the area that I'm talking about today, came out as one of the prominent areas. And so these principles are out there, and it's wonderful how much they've been embraced. And people are really seeing that psychology has an incredibly important role in helping students to learn. The motivation principles, there are 4 of them. 4 of the 20 come from motivation. Students, so one of them, it's principle number 9. That's why there's a 9 there. Students tend to enjoy learning and to do better when they're more intrinsically rather than extrinsically motivated. Students persist in the face of challenging tasks and process information more deeply when they adapt mastery goals rather than performance goals. Teachers' expectations about their students affect students' opportunities to learn, motivation and learning outcomes. And finally, setting goals that are short-term or proximal, specific and moderately challenging, enhance motivation more than setting long-term or distal goals. And I'm going to come back to that one a little bit later. All right, and the final thing I did was I decided to look at the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is our new federal legislation replacing No Child Left Behind. And this is really something particularly important because the way that ESSA works is that a lot of the control, a lot of the testing, a lot of the assessment, a lot of the policy making is going to come back to the state level. And I'm going to come back to this at the end in terms of how can you get involved, how can you make a difference, how can you promote ed psych and show the relevance of ed psych. Well, a lot of the stuff that used to be federal is coming back locally. So I searched ESSA, I searched the actual legislation to see if there are mentions of terms from the field of motivation, and there are. There are 100 matches for engage and engagement. There are 24 matches for interest. There were 9 matches for value, and there were only 5 matches for motivate or motivation, but I think that it's very common for people to use engagement as well, in the field it's not exactly the same as motivation. I think a lot of people in the real world use those interchangeably, which is why there were 100 for engagement and only 5 for motivation. And there were 24 matches for expect or expectations. So my point being that in the Every Student Succeeds Act, there is a lot of emphasis in there on things that we do. And this is what's going to be guiding a lot of what happens in schools and the funding for schools for quite some time, probably. So this is all good news. The news here is that all of these organizations are talking about what we do. They're valuing what we do. So why does all this matter? It matters because one of the things we know is that student learning is hugely dependent upon what we do in ed psych. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir with most of the people who are listening to this, but there are a lot of people out there, and I'm going to talk about this, who don't think it's important for teachers to know this, and don't think that it matters with student learning. It's also particularly important in terms of dropout prevention. And I mention that specifically because when in studies of dropout prevention, there's lots and lots of studies, but one of the most common themes when kids who drop out of school are interviewed and talked to about why did you drop out, it's often because of what boils down to motivation. They were bored, it wasn't relevant, they weren't interested, and they weren't getting good grades in school. And so huge, huge impact. And in terms of if we can prevent dropouts, the savings to society, the economic benefits are phenomenally strong. Another is teachers are leaving the profession very quickly. It's estimated that 40 to 50% of teachers leave within 5 years. All right? Why does that happen? Why are teachers leaving? Well, one of the things that I would say is that teachers are leaving because they're not feeling like it turned out to be what they thought it was going to be. There have actually been some studies that have looked at why teachers are leaving, and one of the reasons is a lot of people go in thinking the day ends at 3 o'clock. Well, it doesn't really end at 3 o'clock. I taught high school and middle school, and I remember thinking that when I graduated college, oh, 3 o'clock, I'm going to be out every day at 3. In reality, it doesn't really work that way. It's a very, very time-consuming profession. People think they're going to get their summer off. You don't really always get your summer off quite the way you plan. There's lots of professional development in the summer, and it's important things that teachers do and need to do in the summer. A lot of teachers leave because they say they're getting a lack of respect. A lot leave because of the paperwork. Some leave because they don't feel that they have job security, particularly because of levies not passing and budgets, local budgets. One of the things that teachers say is the lack of ability to foster creativity in students, and this is one of the things where motivation comes in. Teachers are leaving because a lot go into this in a very idealized manner, thinking, I'm going to do all these really cool things and motivate kids and do these creative things, and when they get there, they're finding that they're not able to do those things. A lot leave because of behavior problems, and whenever I see people leave because of bad behavior, for me, I think of, well, that means the students are not engaged and they're not motivated. And again, that's where I think we have a huge role. If we're teaching in a way that engages and motivates the students, a lot of the behavior problems are not going to be there. And finally, standardized testing is one of the prominent reasons teachers give for leaving. There's too much testing, and I'm sure you all hear about, excuse me, all the movements out there about, standardized testing and how much there is and revolts against it. So anyway, and this is all putting up, I'm flashing my citations up there, but I'm happy to share any of these with anybody who wants more information. I actually looked at some information about, since so many teachers leave the profession, where do they go? They go all over the place. This is from the Brookings Institute. I think it's Brookings. The two most prominent are teachers, about 7% become lawyers and judges. About 6.5%, almost 7% become physicians and surgeons. But they go to all kinds of different fields all over the place when they leave the profession. So I want to move now into what's working against us. And there are a lot of urban myths, there are a lot of legends out there about things that work in education that are not based in science. And I want to mention these because these are, I think, some of the things that we are fighting against. We have, in the field of educational psychology, so much good work out there. We know so much about how to make kids learn and help kids learn and support their learning. We know how to engage them. We know how to motivate them. But there are other things that are happening simultaneously, and there's a lot of big business behind these things that are pushing things to teachers, pushing things into the marketplace for education, into the curriculum, into the materials in school that are not science-based and that actually are problematic and detrimental. And I like to mention these because it's important to be aware of them and sometimes speak out, not in a obnoxious way, but in a professional way when you see some things being done in schools that are not based in science. So I want to give you a few examples. Again, why are these important? These myths work against our goals. They diminished our relevance. And so we need to really do some things to try to debunk some of these things. So anyone who knows me knows this is the one I will be on my tombstone probably. I talk about this all the time, but learning styles is so popular. It is incredibly popular out there. But what are learning styles? Learning styles are really not styles. They are preferences. That's really all that they are. And if anyone doubted it, I think one of the best studies I've seen in a long time, and a really definitive study by Rogowski and colleagues came out just last year in the Journal of Educational Psychology. Really, really well-designed study showing that if you teach two people's learning styles, visual learner, kinesthetic learner, it doesn't make any difference. But there's so many teachers who are doing this, and I'm not faulting teachers, believe me, I'm not criticizing teachers. There's just false information out there saying that this stuff works. Well, these are preferences. That's all that these are. They are preferences. And it's like, I prefer eating French fries to eating maybe, raw fruit. All right, but because it's my preference, it doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be good for me to do that. So some kids prefer to learn visually, some kids prefer to learn by listening, some prefer to learn by touching. There's also a lot of big business out there, and I'm going to show you some of this, selling products, pushing this, and there's a lot of people believe, well, if there's a book about it or there's a curriculum about it, it must work. But again, this JEP article is just, I really, really encourage you to, if you had any doubt about it, to look at that. It's pretty definitive and really closes the door on learning styles as something that benefits learning. There's also some dangers to learning styles. I often share the story and embarrass one of my kids, but my daughter, when she was in, I think, 6th grade, came home, and she's a good student, everything's going well, but her teacher wrote a note saying that she was not participating very much in science lessons. So, and she does well in school, does well in science, so, we asked her, what's going on in science? And she said, well, we have to do a lot of talking in science, and I don't talk because I'm a visual learner. And I said, I beg your pardon, what do you mean? She said, well, somebody in school counselor or somebody came in and gave us an assessment of our learning styles, and I came out as a visual learner. So because I'm a visual learner, I don't have to talk. Well, that did not go down well with me. And I think it's a really good example of how somebody who doesn't want to talk, if you tell them they're visual, maybe they might be the kind of kid who really needs to practice that skill, but they may turn away from it. So I think there can be a lot of dangers in learning styles. One of the things that I did also is, in all of these myths, I went and did a Google search to say how many hits I got. So interestingly, for learning styles, I searched learning styles together, in quotation marks, and I got 464,000 hits. I also looked in the Handbook of Educational Psychology, which Lynn Corno and I co-edited, the most recent one, and it only appears twice in the Handbook of Ed Psych, which has 31 chapters covering pretty much the gamut of Ed Psych. Now, this is obviously a very biased comparison, so it's not scientific, but my point here is that teachers probably will not be using the Handbook of Ed Psych. They'll use Google, and it's all over the place. But when you actually look in the handbook, the topics in this handbook were, we had an advisory board, and I stand by the, there's a lot of science behind this book and what's in it. I think this comparison is extreme, but it shows that from a science point of view, this is just not something that we even really acknowledge. The 2 times it appears in the handbook are both statements about actually why learning styles don't work. So there's nothing in there supporting it. And it's a big, big, big business. I just wanted to show you, if you look on, websites, there's curriculum, it's all over the place, and there's really a lot of money being made selling this. And again, learning styles people think of, how people learn, falls under the umbrella of Ed Psych. But is this something we want under our umbrella? Next one is multiple intelligences. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that multiple intelligences are a myth by any means. Multiple intelligences are intuitively appealing. They are things that are very popular, but I think one of the things that happens is too much emphasis is placed on it. And the research base, as many of you probably know, is not the strongest for multiple intelligences. But it's intuitively appealing because many schools today, almost everyone, if you look at their mission statement, everybody says something like all students can learn, all right? And multiple intelligences become very appealing because what we're essentially saying is that everybody has a talent. And that's true and that's important, and I'm not trying to say that that isn't important. But again, there's a lot of reliance on it and a lot of curriculum built on it. And again, it kind of goes back to, similar to learning styles, there may in fact be preferences or areas where people excel and don't excel, and some of those might be neglected if there's too much focus on designing schools or curricula around multiple intelligences. Again, I did a Google search, multiple intelligences, 478,000 hits, and this is where teachers are probably going to go. Handbook of Ed Psych, 1 citation, and it's simply a very brief acknowledgement in the entire 800 pages in the handbook. So again, it's not something in the Ed Psych world people are really talking about much. If any of you, there's a very wonderful article by Waterhouse and a give and take between her and Howard Gardner back and forth about the research base. And there's debate about it, and I'm not going to get into it. And again, I'm not criticizing multiple intelligences, but it is something that is really become a phenomenon that maybe has gotten a little bit out of control. Again, huge big business, lots of books, lots of materials. This book on the bottom right actually is called Integrating Learning Styles and Multiple Intelligences, so you get 2 for the price of 1. Another one that's hugely popular now is brain-based education, and or teaching to the right and left brain. And this is one that is very big. There's lots and lots of, again, materials out there, workshops, all kinds of stuff out there about it. There is absolutely no support from the field of neuroscience for doing this. And this is not to say that the brain isn't involved in learning. It's hugely involved in learning. But basing what we do in school and how we teach kids on left and right brain and neurology, there is not much support for doing this right now, and there aren't any major professional organizations with scientific backing that really support doing this. How much do we know about the brain? We know a lot and we know a little. Neuroscience has made great strides. We know an awful lot about how it works, and yet every day people are learning new and more new things about the brain. I think some of the most exciting work going on right now is neuroscientists working with physicists, really looking at and applying quantum theory to the brain. And this is all very theoretical, and I've been reading some of this lately, just making me realize how little we really know about how the brain works and how much we're learning. Again, I think it speaks to some of the dangers of running before we can walk and applying all of this to teaching in classrooms. Again, a Google search, brain-based learning, this blew my mind. 5 million, that's not a typo, 790,000 hits. Handbook of Ed Psych, 0. It's not even in there. So again, teachers look for this. They're not going to look in the Handbook of Ed Psych. They're going to look probably in Google. And again, one of the things I was looking at some of the next state-level organizations. This is just an example. The Florida Education Association. One of the first things that pops up on their page is an article about brain-based learning. And if you actually look in the article, it's really not about brain-based learning, but they use that title and talk about it that way. Again, many products out there, whole brain teaching, brain-based teaching, goes on and on. Another one is the area of self-esteem, and this really falls very close in the motivation area. There is a lot out there promoting self-esteem in schools, and this is another one that I think is very, you have to be really careful about this. There are many self-constructs that get confused, And self-esteem specifically, what I'm talking about is the sort of happy, smiley, general self-esteem where you sort of feel good about yourself and you feel smiley about yourself and you feel happy about yourself. Self-esteem, many schools have things like a self-esteem day or something like that. And those can be, I'm going to talk about why that could be problematic. Bottom line is there's little evidence that increasing self-esteem positively affects learning. And one of the big questions when I teach about this and talk about it is whether or not we think about self-esteem as a dependent variable or an independent variable, right? It can be both. I often have talked about and written about how people overemphasize the importance of self-esteem in schools. That doesn't mean it's not important. I have 2 kids. I want my kids to have high self-esteem. That's really, really important. I want them to have it. I want them to feel good about themselves and like themselves. But I don't want to fool myself and think that if they have high self-esteem, it's going to suddenly make them become good readers or be able to solve math problems or be able to shoot a basketball better. That doesn't happen. That is not what self-esteem is about. So I like to think of self-esteem as a dependent variable. It's something I want people to have and get and have simply as a valuable outcome. But I don't want to think of it as an independent variable where by manipulating it, I'm going to make all these other things potentially happen. There's a lot of research about the negative sides of self-esteem in social psychology about particularly violence and self-esteem. If you ever listen on TV to daytime TV talk shows, they're often, I won't name by name, but there's one show in particular where there often used to be a psychologist who would come on and talk to people who in very bad situations, people who had been particularly in abusive relationships, and said, if you had higher self-esteem, you would be able to get out of that relationship. And that things like that really disturb me because that self-esteem is important, but it's not going to magically get somebody out of the relationship. It's not going to magically make somebody be able to solve math problems. And it's very big in schools to have self-esteem day and self-esteem curricula. And those are fine and well, but we have to ask ourselves, you know, what's the end goal? If it's simply to have high self-esteem, great. But if we think it's going to make kids be better at math or science, not so great. Did the search again, Google, 8,780,000 hits. Handbook of Ed site, 0. It's not even in there at all, not once. And there again are so many products out there, and this is just kind of, some of them are really kind of funny. Self-esteem through a protein bar, developing self-esteem in your sleep. I mean, it's everywhere, and I'll say no more about that. So I want to turn now to the case for motivation. I've been talking kind of about all these negative things. I want to talk about using motivation as an example for how we can make ourselves relevant in the 21st century. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with a little thought experiment with you. So if you can bear with me, here's what I'd like you to do. I'm going to read you a scenario, and I'd like you to just imagine you are in the scenario. So imagine that you are a college student. There's a course that you really want to take, and you've heard that it's very difficult. You eventually decide to enroll in the course. So that you work very hard during the course for 4 weeks, first 4 weeks of the semester. At the end of week 4, you take the first exam. After the exam's over, you're not sure how you did. You're not sure, you know, part of you thinks you did well in the exam, part of you thinks you bombed it. You're just not sure how you did. But you take the exam and you leave and you go home. Come back to the next class, and during the next class, the professor comes into the room, and the professor goes up to the whiteboard or chalkboard and puts this up. Okay, I'm sure you've all seen this, a grade distribution. Before handing out the exam, the professor then hands back the exams. You look down at yours and you see that you got an F. How do you feel? All right, so just think about that. How would you feel? You got the F. All right? Now let's play out a little bit of a different scenario. Let's pretend that the same thing happened. You took the difficult class, you took the exam, you're not sure how you did, but instead of this stuff. Instead of the professor putting the distribution up, the professor comes back into the class and simply hands the exams back, no grade distribution. You look down and you see that you got the F, but you see this comment on your paper. Your paper contains a number of errors that are easily correctable. I can see you're using some inefficient strategies to solve some of these problems. Please come by my office hours next week and let me help you with this. I think I can really help you. All right? How would you feel now? Well, I've done this experiment year after year after year in undergraduate classes and graduate classes. And if you're like all the hundreds of students, maybe thousands I've done this with, the same thing happens all the time. In the first scenario, I ask people, what do you feel like doing? And they all say, I'm going to drop the class. They give up. In the second scenario, people don't feel good about getting an F, but there's a lot more encouragement. There's a lot more, I'll give it another try. The motivation is very, very different. And so I use this as an example to really try to emphasize that motivation does matter. And we as educators, as teachers, have a huge impact on our students' motivation. So when we talk about our relevance in the 21st century, little things like this, like how we give feedback after an exam and how we communicate to students about their performance can have a tremendous impact on our students. So our role is extremely, extremely important in these areas. So the empirical evidence for how much our work matters is strong. One of the things with motivation, similar to when I talked about self-esteem, is that motivation can be thought of as both a predictor variable and also as an outcome variable, as a dependent variable. My former advisor, Marty Mayer, wrote an article in 1976 that's still, I think, a classic, and it was in Review of Ed Research, and it was about, the title was Continuing Motivation, a Seldom Considered Outcome. And the idea was that we often think of motivation as a predictor and not as an outcome. And shouldn't we just think about that as something valuable as an outcome? If a student comes out of a class, maybe doesn't get an A, gets a B, but says, I really love that class, I want to take another class, that's continuing motivation. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Motivation is hugely influenced by teachers and instructional practices, and it is incredibly cost effective. There are a lot of short-term interventions out there now that are really promising, and the kinds of things that we can help teachers do, they cost almost no money or very little money to implement. So again, people talk about the costs of school reform. Motivation interventions, motivation changes, using motivational strategies doesn't cost hardly any money at all. If we train people the right way, they can do this. And these are important because they can affect students' entire lives in very important ways, particularly thinking about achievement values, valuing. If somebody leaves school not valuing or not liking science, they're not going to probably go into a science career. If they leave school not liking foreign language, they're not going to probably want to learn a foreign language later on in life. So how we affect our students' values matters a lot. Motivation also is complicated. It's not a one-size-fits-all. There are so many different motivation constructs, theories, ideas out there. And I mention this because we have an awful lot to offer. And again, all of these things can be done and can be implemented in schools at very little cost. All right. There also are some myths about motivation that we need to debunk. And again, I think about what can we as educational psychologists do to maintain our relevance in the 21st century? Well, there are a lot of practices out there that are very well-intentioned but are not rooted in research. So again, we need to think about these motivation myths and work to counter them. I taught a class a couple of times here at Ohio State where we actually explored these myths, and I had a lot of practicing teachers in the classroom, and it was a lot of fun to teach. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance because a lot of people didn't believe some of the things I'm about to talk about, but when confronted with the research, it made them have an aha moment and say, gee, maybe I better rethink some of my practices. So what are some of these typical misconceptions that affect student learning that teachers hold? One of them is that motivation is a characteristic of the student, all right, that generally cannot be changed. This is something many, many teachers think. Many teachers think about this and say, you know, motivation is something internal. I've heard many, many teachers of adolescence say, oh, raging hormones, the hormones in the adolescence, you cannot change that. Okay, this is simply false. Motivation is not only a characteristic of a student. Motivation is hugely determined by the context, by the teacher, by good teachers and by bad teachers. And it makes a big, big difference in terms of what we do, how students are motivated. Second one, comparing student performance enhances motivation. This is another thing that a lot of teachers believe that is false. There's a lot of emphasis in comparing people and putting the best work up as an example for others, in showing the best work, and it doesn't often have a very, very positive effect. Some students respond well and are very motivated by comparative data. Many students respond negatively. I often share the story of a student, a friend of our family's, in elementary school. Young lady was in the same class as my son. I think it was the 4th grade. And the teacher had a chart on the wall that was a chart that indicated how quickly students were able to do their multiplication tables. And you got a star on the chart publicly next to your name when you could do a table, multiplication table, in under 3 minutes. Right? It was timed. And some kids did this very quickly, and other kids did not. And there was one young lady in the class who was a friend of our family's who read good math student, but couldn't do it in under 3 minutes, and saw that everybody else was getting stars, and she was not getting stars. And one day, my son came home and said, I'm going to use a pseudonym, but said, Susan's not very good at math. And that, like, killed kids say that. But it was a very important thing to hear, because I said, why? And he said, well, because she doesn't have any stars up. And, you know, I actually know the parents, and the parents were very, very frustrated by this. And the student left that class really not liking math and feeling very negatively about math. While the parents and other teachers did a lot of repair work, and I can happily say that student has already taken Calculus BC and is doing phenomenally well in math, but many kids don't recover, and it was simply that comparative information up there that really was detrimental. Somebody who completely had the ability to do it. Lots and lots of stuff that goes on about honor rolls, and again, we think these things are motivating, but to the kid who never gets on the honor roll, these things generally are not motivating. In fact, they're very, very frustrating to a lot of those kids. I want to come back to self-esteem, because this is one that's particularly relevant in motivation. A lot of people believe self-esteem improves achievement, improves motivation. Again, as I said earlier, there isn't a lot of evidence that it does that. You can be happy and like yourself and smiley, and it's good for your mental health, and it's a good thing, but it's not going to make you a good reader. There is no research that demonstrates that enhancing general self-esteem leads to higher motivation, and in particular to higher achievement. There just isn't research that shows that. There are correlations, but I'm talking about experimental studies where you raise general self-esteem and you show that that improves academic achievement. High achievers may have high self-esteem, but the self-esteem doesn't necessarily cause that. And of course, as I mentioned before, there's some research linking high self-esteem to negative outcomes like violence, so you've got to be very careful. Also have to be very careful in schools about motivational speakers. There are a lot of motivational speakers, and you can look on the web, who sell their services, who talk about raising self-esteem. He was my all-time favorite. Some of you probably know who that is. Self-esteem is something that, you know, is a speaker going to raise self-esteem? Maybe, maybe not. But is that going to improve achievement? Is that going to reduce violence? Is that going to reduce drug use and unsafe sex? The research says no. So we have to be really careful about how much weight we put on self-esteem. What I think is so important, and the big contribution we can make in EdPsych, is pointing out the differences between self-esteem and self-efficacy. Self-esteem is how we feel about ourselves. Self-efficacy is our perceived ability to succeed at a specific task. And that difference is very, very important. You can increase self-efficacy, and one of the most easy ways to do that, and it goes back to those APA top 20 contributions from psychology. One of them is this idea of setting short-term goals or proximal goals to build self-efficacy. So helping teachers when kids are frustrated, rather than setting a big goal, setting a bunch of little small goals, experiencing success, that builds efficacy, that increases motivation, that instills confidence, and that improves achievement. Increasing self-efficacy, huge research base to show that this is going to make a difference and help kids learn. Increasing self-esteem, probably not so much. Feedback and interactions with students don't affect learning. Again, false. I think that's pretty self-evident, but in teacher education programs, we don't emphasize this enough, how much our interactions really affect learning and motivation. We don't talk enough about that when we're preparing teachers. All our interactions affect motivation. Teachers provide students with constant feedback, and that feedback makes a difference. And we're constantly sending messages to our students through the feedback that we give them. We give feedback on assignments. We give students feedback by how we group them. We give students feedback by whether or not we allow them the opportunity to have choices. Lots and lots of different ways that we're communicating with them, and all these interactions matter. They may seem to teachers like just a trivial interaction. To a student, it can be hugely important. Good relationships between teachers and students are very important. Students need to feel that teachers care about them, particularly care about them as learners. There's a great article, it's kind of dated now, but that Catherine Wenzel had, I think it was in the Journal of Ed Psych, talking about caring teachers caring about students as learners, not just warm fuzzies, but really caring about how you learn and remembering how you learn and what you learn. And it isn't enough just to be a teacher of content. There are a lot of arguments out there and a lot of people who say if teachers just know their content, that's all they need to know. And there's so much talk about that coming from politics, from policy, from certain areas in teacher education. And I will argue until the day I die that is just not enough. You have to care about the relationship and the motivation in the student. It's not just good enough to know math. You have to know how to teach math. You have to know how to teach math to young kids or older kids. Those things matter, and that's what Ed Psych is, and that's where our relevance is. I want to say a little bit about cheating, because I do a lot of work on cheating. A lot of times teachers think that cheating is beyond the teacher's control. That's not true. We can do a lot to prevent cheating. Cheating is not inevitable. A lot of kids get labeled as cheaters. That may or may not be fair, but we can do things to prevent cheating. Cheating is, for the most part, unrelated to gender achievement, SES, race, religion. People have looked at relationships between all kinds of demographic variables, and they just never come out. There are some studies that show that males cheat more than females. I always counter and argue that it's not a big difference. There usually is a difference. It may be that the females are just better at cheating than the males and not getting caught. Don't know, but the differences are small in any event. Students cheat when they have a reason to cheat. That is, it seems this is not rocket science, but you have to, if they know the material and are comfortable with it, they're not going to cheat. They cheat when they have a reason to do so. Stressful classes induce cheating, and a focus on testing induces cheating. And I've spent 20 years looking at this, and the results are pretty much always the same. When students are in a class or an environment that's very high stakes, emphasis on the test, you get cheating. When the emphasis is on mastery and students have an opportunity to remediate, cheating goes down or is almost non-existent. This is not an easy thing to do, but it does work, because the meaning if a class is about mastery, cheating doesn't buy you anything. There's nothing to gain from it if you have to demonstrate mastery. Students are motivated to take tests. Sometimes, particularly with high achievers, we think that they're highly motivated, they want to take tests. Mostly students do not want to take tests. There are very few students who will tell you, I look forward to taking a test. It just doesn't happen that much. Some are motivated to study for tests. Most students don't care about tests. And again, a contribution from Ed Psych is we know pretty darn well that rote memorization does not lead to long-term learning. I was involved in a study years and years ago when I was in graduate school where we were studying how kids learned about current events in the news. And we had kids all over the country who were learning about current events in lots of different ways. But one of the biggest things that we found was that when kids learned current events and had like a quiz on current events on Friday, rote memorization, they did fine. We went back 3 months later and assessed how much they remembered. Kids who were tested and had to rote memorize facts, current events, didn't remember those things 3 months later. Compared with kids who were not tested on it, but had teachers who really talked about it and said, hey, let's just talk about this stuff going on in the news. Those kids 3 months later, they weren't tested, they remembered it. So again, we have to think about the role of assessment. And many, as I said earlier, coming back to this, many teachers report leaving the profession because of all the emphasis on testing. Next, when students are motivated by rewards, this is complicated. It's not true and it's not false, but we use rewards so much in schools, and this is an area, again, where I think in EdPsych we can make such a big contribution by talking to people about how to use rewards effectively. Rewards are not going to go away, but we can use them responsibly or irresponsibly. Research suggests that rewards do decrease intrinsic motivation. If I had more time, I could give you lots of anecdotes about situations where I have seen and been witness to instances where this has happened. Rewards may lead to short-term increases in motivation, but longer term they can lead to some problems. Rewards often become more important than the task. If I don't get the reward, why would I do it? So when we reward kids for reading 25 books, and suddenly we take the reward away and they don't want to read anymore, we have to question, well, why were they doing the reading in the first place? So there are different ways to think about how we use them. There's a lot of research on controlling versus informational rewards. When we're using rewards, if they provide students with if students get the reward because they are learning something and they actually know why they're getting it because of what they learned, that may not be detrimental. But again, the reliance is very, very big. And rewards send messages about what we value. When I taught school, one of the things I did this, I was guilty of this, I did this no homework pass thing. And students loved these, and I gave these out as rewards. And in retrospect, I think back about it now and think, oh, maybe that wasn't the best idea, because what's the message it sends? Your reward for doing well is that you don't have to do your schoolwork. So we have to sometimes think about the message it sends and if we really think a reward may or may not be appropriate. Number 9, it doesn't matter if students enjoy what they're learning. They'll be motivated to learn it if it's required. Again, this is something that I think most people in EdPsych embrace and know, but I don't think all the people who are working in the profession realize it, and we need to remind people that students need to appreciate what they are learning, all right? If students don't value what they're learning and expect to succeed at what they're learning, they're not going to be motivated. This is expectancy value theory. So valuing, when we're teaching, are we conveying that the material is important and interesting and useful and it's worth their time? All right, I remember many, many times talking to kids about social studies and history and kids saying, oh, it's so boring. And I don't know why we're doing it, and I don't know why it's important. And sometimes it just takes pointing out to kids that learning about history and things that have happened in history sometimes can help us in the future to prevent history from repeating itself. We don't want it to, that there is utility value to understanding where we come from, but do we take the time to really tell people about that? Final one, motivation is the same across all subject areas. That's just not true. We all know that. Different kids are motivated in different areas differently, all right? And that's just the way it is, and we need to acknowledge that and know that, and using some of the things I've talked about, help kids who are not motivated in some area maybe become motivated more in that area. All right, so to summarize, what are some of the threats to our relevance? How is this actually playing out? Well, EdPsych, first of all, in teacher ed programs often gets absorbed into other courses. Very often I have seen that we get subsumed in a course on child or adolescent development. And I would say it's not the same thing. I have fought this battle at multiple universities where people have said, well, we'll just have them take adolescent development and they don't have to take ed psych. If you look at the curriculum in ed psych and the curriculum in child or adolescent development, there is not a lot of overlap. If you look at an ed psych textbook, there's usually one chapter on development. The rest is on learning and motivation and assessment. And so, you know, I don't buy this argument that we can just do it all in one class, because what happens is it just gets lost. To me, ed psych is to teacher ed as anatomy is to being a doctor. Would we ever want to send someone through medical school and never give them a course in anatomy? Imagine if you went in a doctor's office and the doctor said, well, I never took an anatomy course, but I think there's something wrong with your elbow. That's an extreme example, but it's, I think, a relevant example. You'd go running out of that office so quickly. But if we said to, you know, a teacher said, well, I've never had a course on learning. I don't really know how people learn. I don't know theories of learning, but here's what I think might work. You know, that's okay. Well, it's not okay. Another threat is, and I hate to say this, but there is a big threat coming from learning sciences. And I want to go out on a limb and say this because I've seen a lot of divisiveness in the last few years where people in the learning sciences and ed psych are drawing lines and saying learning sciences are X and ed psych is Y, and the two are different. And I mean, this really frustrates me. We're all about learning. We're all about how kids learn. There are some differences. There are some differences in approaches. There are some differences in theories. But at the end of the day, the sum is greater than the parts. And I really do not think that the divisiveness when people are saying that, you know, learning sciences are in and ed psych's out, or ed psych's in and learning sciences is out, helps us. We all are working toward the same goal. And whether or not you're in a department of ed psych or learning sciences, it doesn't matter. And we need to, I'm scared by the lines that I see getting drawn because they're completely unnecessary and completely unjustifiable. Another argument is that content knowledge is all that matters. I mentioned this earlier. A lot of people say that. If teachers just know their content, that's all they need. Well, I think I've hopefully done a good job of showing you why it's necessary but not sufficient. It's not all they need. Another argument you hear is, well, students have to graduate in 4 years, so something has to give, so let's drop the ed psych class. And we have to fight that. We have to fight that and argue against that. Another thing that I still hear sometimes is when people think of ed psych, people who are not in the field still think we're all behaviorists. And I'm not disparaging behaviorists. Some of my best friends are behaviorists. Behaviorism is wonderful, but that's not all that ed psych is. And there are some people who are still living in this anti-behaviorist movement that's 40, 50 years old and thinking of everybody under one umbrella. All of us study learning in different ways, and they all matter. Finally, and I'm almost done, what can we do? There are lots of things we can do on a local level and a big level. Because the ESSA Act is moving down to the state level, I think this gives us a wonderful opportunity at the state, at the local level, to get involved. So as someone in the field of ed psych, what can you do? Well, volunteer to speak at a local school. There are so many in-services and professional developments out there, and many of them are on things like brain-based learning and learning styles. You all can go out and say, hey, can I come in and talk to you about motivation or learning theory, and actually not to disparage the others, but to talk about some things that are really based in research. Another thing, write a practitioner article. This is not something that's rewarded in research universities, but once in a while I think it's something important to do. I've had a couple of articles in practitioner journals, I've had some in Ed Leadership, and I have had more interaction and response from people who read the article in those kinds of things than any article in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Practitioner articles reach the practitioners, and so if we want to make an impact, that's a good way to do it. Inform your public relations office at your university about your research. This is really important. PR offices love this stuff. They want to publicize this, and a lot of education research is very appealing to them, but they don't know about it, and they don't go out of their way to look for it. So you should be promoting yourself. Self-promotion isn't a bad thing with good research. Get involved and with policy at the local, state, and federal level. There are lots of ways you can do this, even through school boards, through being committees, organizations. Another way is influencing professional standards. This is something that I think we need to have more of a voice in. I've been privileged to be on the committee that's writing the new elementary standards for CAPE, and I've sort of taken it as my mission and a few other people to make sure that EdPsych is in there and is in there prominently. And I think that's very important that when these standards get written, we have to keep them in there. Make sure you're at the table when curricular decisions are being made. When curriculum is being decided, there should be someone from EdPsych at the table. I have been at universities where we have been at the table. I have been at universities where we have not been at the table. We need to be at the table, and we need to fight to be at the table. And finally, speak out. When you see people using things like learning styles and brain-based learning in a careful, professional, and tactful manner, point out that the research base may be weak for it. You don't want to come across as a jerk and as an academic from the ivory tower, but you want to point out that some of these things are questionable because, as I said, some of these things don't help learning, and some of them actually truly can be really dangerous and really hurt kids sometimes. So that is all I have to say. I want to thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it back to Matt for some questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Eric. We had one question come across here, the chat, I'd like to pose to you. What do you see as being the cutting edge and critical questions for motivation research? And what are your thoughts on the role of social relations in shaping motivation, such as peer and such?
Okay, great question. Well, I think social relations are so, they're just part of motivation research, and I think a lot of people have acknowledged that for a long time. Most motivation theories right now we call social cognitive because we embrace that the social part is as important as the cognitive part. So social is, I don't think we can look at motivation in isolation in academic settings at all without considering it. What's a cutting edge question? One of the cutting edge questions right now is I think there's a lot of research on short-term interventions, very quick interventions that are proving to be very, very effective. And I think we need more research on how they work, why they work, and when they don't work. I think that's extremely important. The other thing that I think is really important is doing motivation research where, again, we're looking at how to infuse motivation into practice and really looking at how that makes a difference for kids. We know all of these things that work. We know all of these things that matter with motivation. I think we need to be doing more classroom research where we're doing interventions and we're implementing these things and we're looking at fidelity to intervention and really using motivation strategies and using them appropriately and over a long period of time and measuring the effect. I would so strongly hypothesize that the potential has not even begun to be realized for these things, but we need to really be doing some good studies, quantitative, qualitative, ethnographies, all kinds, all research, all methodologies welcome to really document how these things can make a difference.
Okay. One question came across our Facebook page, and also a similar question came up during the seminar here, or webinar. It's kind of related to small, specific, concrete steps to disseminating research, getting involved. Could you provide some specific, I know you just did give a couple examples, but what would you think would be, I guess, the best way to disseminate research?
Well, I think two of the things that I just said in that last slide, one of them is writing a practitioner article. Those can have a huge, huge impact, and they reach the right people in the right places. And the second thing is, again, doing professional development. There are professional development people in school districts who are responsible. When teachers are all going back to school in the next few weeks, they're all going to be sitting through professional development. We're some of the people who should be doing that professional development. There are a lot of people out there doing really good professional development. There are a lot of people out there doing really bad professional development. And these are the kinds of things we can volunteer to do. If you work in a university, you have to do service. This is a kind of service you can do. Doing professional development, where we're actually talking about the kinds of things that, whether it's motivation or cognition or strategies or whatever it is, things that are based in research and showing teachers and administrators how to do these things and simply disseminating it at a very local sort of grassroots level. It's very, very doable. And I guarantee you, if you call up a school and volunteer to do this, and then you say you're a professional in the field, they're not going to throw you out. They're going to embrace it. They're going to love it. They're going to want this.
Yeah. I actually saw somebody presenting at EPA a poster, I think, two years ago, and they were doing this as part of one of their EdSite courses. They actually went to a school, got a topic that they then researched and had their grad students go through the literature to provide sort of consultation to that district about that topic. So I thought that was kind of a neat way to also involve the students in doing that. So a couple other questions have come across our chat here. Let me see, scrolling through this small window here. Do you see a role of positive psychology in education to improve motivation for students?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that positive psychology has so much to offer, and I think a lot of there hasn't been a huge convergence of sort of the positive psychology research and motivation research, but there's been, I'd say, an indirect relationship in that a lot of what I've been talking about is how we can use motivation research in a very positive way, rather than to focus on the negatives and the detriments and what people do not have as ability, to use these things to focus on the positive. I think the whole idea, as I mentioned before, about proximal goals to build self-efficacy, I think that fits beautifully with positive psychology, because the idea is to, when somebody doesn't have confidence, doesn't have self-efficacy, we have ways that we can, with very small steps, build efficacy, build confidence, and make people feel good about their abilities in areas where they've had a lack of confidence. That is positive psychology. Attribution theory, giving people feedback that promotes positive attributions rather than negative attributions. That's what positive psychology is all about. So I think it's there. I don't think people have pointed it out, but I think the potential is huge for it.
Okay. Another question we had come in. Many motivation studies use surveys as the main measures. What are other measures that you think the field of motivation should design to help move our field forward?
Great question, and I think that we need multiple kinds of assessments. I don't want to throw surveys away. I know there's a lot of backlash against surveys. Surveys have lots of problems, and there's lots of negatives about them. But at the end of the day, surveys are self-report of how people feel, and in psychology, we can't forget the fact that self-perception is hugely important. So that really matters. So I think surveys are important. That being said, though, there are so many other ways to assess motivation, and I could name them off. But I think one of the ways, obviously, there's qualitative studies, observations, interviews. I think interviews are not done enough, really in-depth interviews. One of the things we did in the cheating research is we did a study, which we haven't published anything from yet, but where we had surveyed cheating to death. And we got the same results and all the time, and it's pretty replicable. So what we found is that extrinsic motivation predicts cheating, mastery. When you're in a mastery environment, it doesn't. So what we then did is finally said, all right, we've got to take the next step where surveys cannot get at, so why is this happening? So we did a study where we interviewed in-depth 60 adolescents for between a half hour to an hour each about the decision-making that goes behind that, what happens. And again, we haven't published it yet, but huge amount of rich information. Another area that I don't think a lot of people have used that I think is important to consider is using scenarios. Tamara Murdoch and some of her colleagues used scenarios to study cheating, where they just simply gave scenarios and manipulated some of the variables, where in one scenario somebody was intrinsically motivated and one they were extrinsically motivated, and then asking people to react to those and to see what they agree and disagree with. There's lots and lots and lots of possibilities. But I think, again, it comes down to triangulating and using multiple. There's no one silver bullet. There's no one magic way. We need to use all of these together to really develop the kind of understanding we want to have.
Okay. Final question here, as we're about to run out of time. Scrolling through here a couple. So we have so many motivation constructs, theories, several of which you mentioned here today, like self-efficacy and value. How would you suggest that we distill down the complexity of motivation to hopefully help make it more useful, accessible to teachers, and ultimately keep ourselves more relevant, like you've been saying?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that I had that list up before of all those different constructs, and it didn't include everything in there. And I think that, at the end of the day, motivation is it's simple and it's complex at the same time. But if you think about learning, the word learning, you can't just say, how can we encapsulate learning into a couple of key points? There's a lot to learning. Well, there's a lot to motivation, and so I think all of those things are very, very important. And I think that one of the places where we really need to think about, rather than I'm not for necessarily shrinking them down into one or two constructs that consume everything. I don't think there are some very subtle differences between, people will say, for example, performance goals and ego goals and relative ability goals. That level of nuance is something we do in the research world that does not help the practitioners. They look at that and they roll their eyes and say, what are you talking about? But on the flip side of that, we don't want to distill it down to say that there aren't differences between, let's say, mastery goals and intrinsic motivation. They're very similar, but they're not the same thing. Performance goals and extrinsic motivation, they're similar, but they're not the same thing. And when you do things to encourage one or another of these, you're not going to necessarily have the same outcome. So I don't think we want to get to the point where we distill it too much. All right? So there's nuances, like I said, with different names and labels for goals, and researchers will argue that they're different, and from a research level they are. But then from a practitioner level, we have to think, what's the smallest meaningful unit of analysis? So I would say, a mastery goal and a learning goal, they're probably the same thing, but a mastery goal is not the same as a performance goal.
I've recently been using one of Lindley's articles, Lindley and Leake, of the ABCs of motivation in some of my classes, and I've honestly just started using that the past 2-3 semesters, and finding that in the motivation and development class I teach, that's been really, really helpful for helping students or pre-service teachers get their head around motivation, I think. All right, well, thank you very much for joining us, Eric, and everyone online. I'm very actually pleased to mention, by the way, that the webinar committee has now become a standing committee for APA Division 15, so this is something we're going to be continuing to do in the future. So I hope everyone will keep on the lookout for great webinars like we had today in the future. So thanks again, Eric. Appreciate your time and great information today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. I appreciate it.